I'm Slava Tilba. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today I'm talking to Chuck Collins. Chuck, you are the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, author of the books Born on Third Base, A One Percenter Makes the Case for Tackling Inequality, Bringing Wealth Home, and Committing to the Common Good. Is Inequality in America Irreversible? And your book, Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions, will be published in March. You have co-authored several IPS reports, The Road to Zero Wealth, How the Racial Wealth Divide is Hollowing Out America's Middle Class, Billionaire Bonanza, The Forbes 400 and the Rest of Us, and Gilded, Giving, Top-Heavy Philanthropy in an Age of Extreme Inequality. You co-founded the organizations Wealth for the Common Good and United for a Fair Economy. First, how have you decided to work on the subject of inequality? Were you influenced by literature, historical, or contemporary figures?
Well, thank you for having me, Slava. And I think that probably the experience that influenced me the most was growing up in a wealthy suburb of Detroit, Michigan. And in the 1960s, Detroit was, one of the biggest cities in the United States. But I lived in the sort of outside suburbs, and I grew up in a wealthy family. But so I had this front row seat of both wealth, but then I would travel into Detroit and see not only the economic, but also the racial gap between my life. So I think that at a young age, that affected me, seeing the great inequality. And then I've just seen over my life, inequality grow over 50 years. So those are the forces that I think shape me. Later, I think I read books and studied more the data, but I think it informed my understanding deeper. But it was really that childhood experience of living in great inequality.
How would you describe yourself and why? Anarchist, communist, socialist, democrat?
I think I am a more of a decentralist, an anarchist, I guess, in that tradition, meaning that I don't think it's too much central power. I'm suspicious of it, whether it's the power of capital or the power of the state. That said, I think in the United States, we are so far from having even just a healthy capitalism. There's many flavors of capitalism. There's the extractive capitalism of the United States, the hyper individualistic, and then there's the Nordic countries, Denmark, and democratic socialist countries. I would be happy if we could move anywhere in the direction of a more social democratic society.
The report Billionaire Bonanza points out that between 1990 and 2020, US billionaire wealth soared 1,130%, an increase more than 200 times greater than the 5.37% growth of US median wealth. How do you explain that? Isn't the solution to increase the wealth of working and middle class people rather than reduce the billionaire wealth they earned it? What would we do without their contribution to society?
Well, the cause is that the rules of the economy have been tipped in favor of wealth holders at the expense of workers and wage earners. So over the last 40 years, worker productivity has greatly increased, but most of the gains of that productivity have gone to the owners of enterprises. So, we could have much less inequality if we did. The United States in the years after World War II, 1947 to 1977, in those decades, the bottom fifth and the top fifth, their incomes rose at the same level, same in the middle. Everybody saw their incomes double. It was a shared prosperity economy. In the last 40 years, we've been a pulling apart economy. So, that's really one of the driving forces that's caused these inequalities. And when I say the rules, I mean like tax policy, trade policy, government spending. All those things have been really good for wealth holders and investors and not good for wage earners and workers.
But aren't people billionaires for a reason? They are exceptionally talented, they work extremely hard. That's why they succeed, and accordingly, other people don't succeed. It's a meritocracy. You talked about the very individualistic system in the United States.
Right. Well, I think, that there are differences between people. You probably work harder than me. Maybe you should be rewarded a little bit more, but you shouldn't be rewarded 1,000 times more or 1,000,000 times more. And so the inequality, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a billionaire is a policy failure, meaning that it means, that they've gotten too much of the rewards and other people have gotten too little. There are a lot of people who work hard and don't have anything to show for it. And there's a lot of billionaires who are just lucky. They were at the right place at the right time. They inherited wealth. A huge amount of wealth at the very top is inherited. So they were fortunate to pick wealthy parents, and others may have innovated and created something useful, but that doesn't mean they should have rewards so enormous. So I think of the existence of billionaires as a policy failure, a societal failure.
It sounds like you agree with Senator Sanders on this point.
Yeah, I think Senator Sanders, and I've known him for almost 35 years. He's been saying the same thing for a long time, that extreme inequality is bad for societies. Too much of the rewards are going to the top. The fact that, in 1983, there were only 19 billionaires. And today, as of this morning, there were 657 billionaires in the United States. That is not a happy statistic. That's not a good sign. That's not a measure of health. It's actually a measure of a problem. Too much wealth going to the top, not enough going to everyone else.
What about the wealth they are giving back? It is often in the headlines. Where is it going? Is it making a difference?
In terms of charity and philanthropy, giving back in that way, is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there are examples of some of the billionaires who are sharing their money through charity, but oftentimes I think of that as a distraction. We have a system in the United States where wealthy people give their money to a charity or create a private foundation, and they get a tax break, a very big tax break. For every dollar that a billionaire gives to charity, the taxpayers of the United States are losing about 75 cents of revenue that would have come in if we had taxed that billionaire. And so a lot of times the philanthropy is self-serving, or it's an extension of their own power and influence, or it's an attempt to kind of create a sense of virtue in terms of what they're doing. But the most important thing to say is philanthropy, sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's good, but it's not a substitute for a fair tax system where wealthy people pay their fair share of taxes. So I think we need to change the rules of philanthropy to discourage rich people from just creating private foundations, and we should be taxing them at higher levels.
Anand Girendaridas has been also talking about these problems with charity. Could you please address the rising inequality right now? It makes sense that during a pandemic with the lockdowns, a company delivering goods such as Amazon or a telecommunications company such as Zoom has enormous profits. But how does one explain the rising wealth of Elon Musk? Are people all buying Teslas? How do you explain it?
I think part of what's going on is that Wall Street and investors are always looking, they're essentially betting on what's going to go up in the future. So Elon Musk and his battery technologies, that's probably a smart bet. That is what the future will hold. In the case of Amazon or Zoom, the Wall Street is saying these people have temporary monopolies. Uh, you know, uh, in the case of Amazon, Main Street businesses have been closed. Their competition has been shut down, and they're making more money. So they're the beneficiaries of the pandemic. I would call them pandemic profiteers because they're benefiting when others are suffering or seeing their businesses close down. Zoom, you and I are talking on Zoom. You know, it is a technology that in a way is as important as electricity now and probably should be regulated or owned by public utilities. So I think video conferencing in the future shouldn't be a for-profit business. It should be something that is protected in the commons.
In the report, Billionaire Bonanza, you and your co-authors make a number of recommendations. You have already touched upon some of them. Establish a pandemic profiteering oversight committee, passage of the Corporate Transparency Act, millionaire income surtax, a charity stimulus, a state tax that is more progressive, and a wealth tax, plus shutting down the global hidden wealth system. What organization should one pressure to achieve these goals in your view?
What organizations? I think that there are organizations in the United States like the Americans for Tax Fairness that have been pushing for, good tax policies. There's a network called the Patriotic Millionaires who are business leaders and wealthy people who support these policies. I mean, in a way, I think that they are broadly popular. People believe the wealthy should pay their fair share, and those are examples. And I think during the pandemic, we need the US Congress to, just like during times of war, when some companies are extracting big profits during a time of trouble or sacrifice, we should be monitoring to make sure that some corporations and wealthy people are not grabbing more than their fair share. And I think that those are widely popular ideas. Polls show that people support the policies that you mentioned.
But politicians don't, do they? Joe Biden's campaign has received, according to Forbes, donations from around 130 billionaires or their spouses. Could you talk about that phenomenon, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris records?
Sure. I mean, I think part of what we have is a system problem, which is that wealth has captured our political system, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. wealthy donors are shaping the contours of what's possible. And that's the biggest problem because, right now, the policies that you and I were talking about, taxing wealth, raising the minimum wage, eliminating debt for students, those are very popular policies. 70-80% of the public supports them, but wealth is blocking it. Now, I think, the good news is with incoming President Biden, Kamala Harris, they're going to be responsive to pressure. And it's really up to the rest of us to create the social movements and the pressure to push for these policies. And I believe they will respond to that pressure. Unlike the Republicans who will just stand up and create a wall and ignore that pressure, I think we will see some changes. Like President Biden, President-elect Biden has proposed raising taxes on the wealthy. Only those with $400,000 in income and up will pay more under a Biden tax plan. That's exactly right. They talk about enforcing the rules and shutting down some of the tax loopholes and ways in which wealthy people dodge taxes and corporations. That's a very important part of the program. So I think we will see some changes. Not as big a changes as I would like, but we will see some changes.
Could you please comment on President Biden's economic advisors? Janet Yellen for Secretary of the Treasury, Neera Tanden for Director of Office of Management and Budget, Cecilia Rouse, Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. How do you assess what we are seeing so far from the Biden transition team?
Yeah, I think it's pretty early to tell. I think that he has picked safe, centrist choices. They are not entirely beholden to Wall Street and to finance, but they are not people who are particularly concerned about the plight of low-wage workers. I think Janet Yellen is a pretty okay choice in that she understands the dangers of these inequalities in the society. She's spoken about them. She has many of the same solutions that I would put on the table to addressing inequality. And as Secretary of the Treasury, she has a lot of power around things like tax enforcement and discouraging wealthy people from hiding their money. But again, it's not like a Bernie Sanders perspective that recognizes deep structural inequalities and a really important need to change the rules. They're not coming from that perspective, but it could be worse in a sense.
What aspects of the points you and your colleagues have put forward are most realistic? Where should activists, political groups start?
Well, I think right immediately we should support the end sort of tax cheat legislation that Congressman Ro Khanna and others are putting forward, which is to strengthen enforcement, to strengthen the Internal Revenue Service so that they audit rich people who have trusts and are using their power to dodge the estate tax. So enforcement is important. I do think raising the top income tax on millionaires is a winnable tax policy. Raising the minimum wage would do a lot to lift the floor, and expanding healthcare for everybody, instituting a public option, disconnecting your healthcare from your job. Right now, if you lose your job, you lose your healthcare. Coming out of the pandemic, more and more people understand why that's not a good system. I think those are winnable. And I think the experience of the pandemic and the memory of the importance of essential frontline workers and how rich the rich have become during the pandemic are going to be the values that will help shape the next couple of months. And I expect that we can see some meaningful victories in the next couple months.
What is your assessment of the legislation currently being negotiated. At the moment, it looks like there could be a stimulus for Americans, but not a high one.
Yeah. It's a really unfortunate that the Republicans have kind of held COVID relief hostage, that they've been so focused on, kind of trying to take the election and not protect workers. Here in the United States, we are going into a winter of pain. In some regions, we're seeing COVID infections that are significantly higher than March and April. And then Congress passed, an economic stimulus act and legislation to help the unemployed, almost $2 trillion of support for businesses and individuals. This time around, it's going to be smaller. There's going to be less support and help for people who are unemployed. Even right now, as unemployment is rising again, because more and more parts of the economy are being shut down for good reason. The rates of infection are so high. So the new stimulus bill is too late and too small. It really needs to have happened more than a month ago. It's going to be very hard in the next couple of weeks to get money into people's hands when it really, they needed it yesterday. But something is better than nothing. So I'm hoping that they'll move quickly in the next day or two to make that happen.
You mentioned Representative Ro-Khanna. What would you say about the actions of Representatives Pelosi, of Representative Neal? How have they been responding to the current crisis?
Well, I think, Representative Pelosi has been trying to negotiate for the right things, aid to states and localities, local cities and towns and states, because they are not able to print money like the federal government, are reeling in the face of budget cuts. So I think she's been a strong leader in pushing for a broad and meaningful COVID relief package. Representative Neal, I've known him for decades. He was the mayor of Springfield. He primarily is the representative of a number of industry groups, including the insurance industry. He's not, he's done some good things, but he's not a bold champion of fair tax policy. He's very cautious. So I'm hoping he will understand this is the moment. If we're going to fix the tax code and make it fairer and make sure billionaires and multimillionaires pay their fair share, Richie Neal needs to step up and not be bought off by his big donors.
One thing that has been coming up is austerity. As a non-economist, when I hear that there is a crisis and so much is going on, I think that it's necessary to save money. One cannot give out money, one cannot spend money. That's what ordinary people do when they have little they save.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, we expect on January 21st that we're going to hear a lot about budget deficits and austerity again, because the Republicans have nothing else to contribute to this conversation. They've been, they spent $2 trillion on a tax cut that primarily went to the super rich 1% and a couple hundred global companies. There was no one talking about their concerns about deficits then or the national debt. They were happy to add to the debt. So these people who are going to talk about austerity and debt are completely hypocrites. Most of them are hypocrites. The reality is we should be borrowing and spending at this moment. This is an emergency. This is basic Keynesian policy 101. You need to have demand and you need to have money spent in the economy, and individuals are not in a good position to do that. And it's important for government to do that, either putting money in people's hands or through public investments in infrastructure. This would be the time to make big investments in building a green infrastructure, retrofitting, public buildings, building mass transit. those are public investments that create jobs that would help the economy in the next 2 years. So when the deficit hawks and the austerity people come along, we need to say, sit down, be quiet. We have big problems to solve. Don't restrain government at this moment from making those important investments.
You mentioned that you have known Senator Sanders and that you have known Representative Neal. Have you thought about being on the other side? And have you thought about um, lobbying, like the people whose conduct you describe in the report, on the other side, not fighting against inequality, but using the current economic conditions, the rigged system?
I'm not sure I understand your question, but I mean, I think I do speak out, and I do get to lobby in an informal way, and I can do a certain amount of lobbying, even working for a research group. And as an individual private citizen, yeah, sure, I kind of am an advocate for these changes.
What is next for you, Chuck?
Well, I'm excited, Slava, because I have the book coming out called The Wealth Hoarders. You mentioned The Wealth Hoarders, how billionaires spend millions to hide trillions. And I think we're not going to be able to fix inequality when the super rich are hiding so much money. And they use trusts and offshore tax havens and shell companies. And we're talking trillions of dollars globally. So I'm really looking forward to talking to people and waking us up as a society and saying, look at the enormous amount of wealth that's being hidden. And we continue to do our website, inequality.org, which I hope your listeners will check out. And we have a newsletter that comes out every Monday. It comes from me. And I hope that people will sign up to learn more about what we can all do together to reduce inequality.
Thank you very much for this interview, Chuck.
Thank you for having me.
I wish you all best for your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Slava, for the chat.